Biden officials will resume Venezuela deportations, extend border wall. U.S. officials said Thursday that they will resume direct deportation flights to Venezuela and fast-track construction of new barriers along the southern border, moves aimed at curbing the record number of illegal crossings into the United States under President Biden. Nearly 500,000 Venezuelans have crossed the southern border since 2020, and U.S. authorities have had little ability to return them as a result of strained U.S. relations with the autocratic government of President Nicolas Maduro. Biden officials who briefed reporters on the plans Thursday did not say how many deportation flights they plan to send, and declined to discuss negotiations with the Maduro government. The announcement comes 2 weeks after Biden extended temporary legal status to more than 470,000 Venezuelans living in the United States, saying political and economic turmoil in their homeland made it unsafe to send them home. Only Venezuelans who arrived before July 31 are eligible for the temporary legal status, and Biden officials said those who have arrived illegally since then will be a priority for the deportation flights. Venezuelans account for the largest number of migrants staying in badly strained shelters in New York, whose mayor, Eric Adams, Democrat, has become a sharp critic of President Biden's handling of border issues. Other Democrats have criticized Biden for leaving in place U.S. economic sanctions on Venezuela that they say are driving even more people to flee. The Maduro government issued a statement Thursday acknowledging the deal while blaming the exodus of its citizens on U.S. policies it denounced as a direct consequence of coercive unilateral measures and the blockade of our economy. More than 7 million Venezuelans have left their nation over the past decade, and many of those making the dangerous trek through Panama's Darien jungle en route to the United States have been living in Colombia, Ecuador, and other nations in the region. They now risk a return to a country roiled by food shortages, power blackouts, and organized crime. The Department of Homeland Security said the decision to resume Venezuela deportations was consistent with the administration's efforts to implement a strategy of humane, safe, and orderly enforcement of our immigration laws and to process individuals in a fair and fast manner. The DHS said those efforts include a major expansion of legal opportunities for Venezuelans to enter the United States that has allowed nearly 70,000 to arrive this year through a program known as Humanitarian Parole Process, or after making an appointment at the southern border using a mobile application. The announcement followed a separate notice from Biden officials who said they will bypass environmental and conservation laws for the first time to fast-track barrier construction along the southern border, citing an acute and immediate need to stop soaring numbers of migrants crossing illegally in the Rio Grande Valley of Texas. That announcement, published in the Federal Register, amounted to a shift for Biden, who rebuked his predecessor's pet project by vowing as he ran for office that he would not build another foot of wall. Biden halted construction on Inauguration Day in January 2021. Asked by reporters at the White House on Thursday about his administration's plans, the president said he did not believe the barriers were effective but construction had to move forward because Congress already appropriated the money. "I can't stop that," Biden said, without elaborating. He took no further questions. The Federal Register notice issued by the DHS said the administration faces an overwhelming increase in illegal border entries, requiring new barriers whose construction cannot be delayed by U.S. environmental laws and other safeguards. There is presently an acute and immediate need to construct physical barriers and roads in the vicinity of the border of the United States in order to prevent unlawful entries, said the notice, signed by Homeland Security Secretary Alejandro Mayorkas. Mayorkas said the administration will waive more than 24 laws, including the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act and the National Historic Preservation Act. His notice described plans for new segments of fencing at 10 locations in the Rio Grande Valley, where U.S. agents made nearly 245,000 border arrests during the 2023 fiscal year that ended September 30. Biden's pause on construction in January 2021 left the $11 billion wall, one of the most expensive federal infrastructure projects in U.S. history, with dozens of gaps and piles of unused steel bollards lying around in the desert. Republican lawmakers have been trying to force the administration to resume construction on the roughly 250 additional miles of barriers called for in the Trump plan. President Donald Trump added about 450 miles of barriers during his term. Biden's Inauguration Day order that halted construction allowed for exceptions to avert immediate physical dangers. Mayorkas later authorized crews to close some unfinished areas using money previously authorized by Congress, citing concerns such as site safety, erosion prevention, and a need to shore up the structural integrity of the barriers. Asked about the need for the waivers, U.S. Customs and Border Protection officials took an expansive view of the safety exception, saying the protection of U.S. agents, migrants, and border communities fits within the scope of Biden's January 2021 order. CBP officials said the new segments they plan to build will minimize environmental impacts by using a movable jersey barrier foundation, in contrast to existing segments of the barriers that are anchored in concrete. CBP remains committed to protecting the nation's cultural and natural resources and will implement sound environmental practices as part of the project covered by this waiver, CBP spokesperson Aaron Waters said in a statement. Last month, Border Patrol agents made nearly 219,000 arrests along the southern border, the highest monthly tally in 2023, according to preliminary CBP data obtained by the Washington Post. The Rio Grande Valley was CBP's second busiest sector in September, after Arizona's Tucson sector, the data shows. U.S. agents have made more than 6 million arrests along the southern border during the past 3 years, the busiest span in the 100-year history of the Border Patrol. Wildlife advocates who applauded Biden's construction freeze in 2021 said they were dismayed to see his administration adding more miles of steel barriers, which block the migratory routes of larger mammals. It's disheartening to see President Biden stoop to this level, casting aside our nation's bedrock environmental laws to build ineffective wildlife-killing border walls, Lakin Jordahl, Southwest conservation advocate at the Center for Biological Diversity, said in a statement. The area where the new segments will be added, Stark County, is home to some of the most spectacular and biologically important habitat left in Texas, and now bulldozers are preparing to rip right through it, Jordahl said. This is a horrific step backwards for the borderlands. The border wall's effectiveness at preventing illegal crossings remains a point of contention. Smuggling organizations in Mexico have sawed through its steel bars thousands of times, requiring millions of dollars in repairs. Smugglers also regularly deploy cheap ladders to bring migrants over the top, lowering them down the other side with ropes. Mayorkas issued a separate statement saying the barrier extension did not amount to a policy change. From day one, this administration has made clear that a border wall is not the answer, Mayorkas said. That remains our position and our position has never wavered. The language in the Federal Register notice is being taken out of context and it does not signify any change in policy whatsoever. Samantha Schmidt in Bogota, Colombia, contributed to this report. White House planning face-to-face meeting with Xi Jinping in California. With tension high, the leaders will look to reset relations at the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in November, administration officials say. The White House has begun making plans for a November meeting in San Francisco between President Biden and Chinese leader Xi Jinping, an attempt to stabilize the relationship between the world's two most powerful countries, according to senior administration officials. It's pretty firm there will be a meeting, said one administration official, speaking on the condition of anonymity because the engagement has not yet been announced formally. We're beginning the process of planning, the official said. A second senior administration official said that Biden looks forward to meeting Xi, but that nothing has been confirmed yet. Plans will firm up after Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi comes to Washington in the coming weeks, administration officials said. The in-person meeting would be the first between the leaders of the two largest economies since they met on the sidelines of the Group of 20 summit in Bali, Indonesia, last November. There, both presidents emphasized the importance of face-to-face diplomacy and expressed hope they could get U.S.-China relations back on track. But after Biden ordered the shoot-down of a Chinese spy balloon that traveled over the continental United States in February, ties frayed further. In an effort to re-engage, four top Biden administration officials have traveled in recent months to Beijing, including Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Treasury Secretary Janet L. Yellen, Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo and Climate Envoy John F. Kerry. Last month, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan held 2 days of talks with Wang in Malta. The White House described those conversations as candid, substantive and constructive. But communications between top American military officials and their counterparts in Beijing remain frozen, despite repeated overtures by the American side. In March, she accused Washington of leading an effort by the West to implement containment, encirclement and suppression of China to slow its development. And last month, China's main spy agency, the Ministry of State Security, indicated in a cryptic and unusual post on its WeChat social media page that prospects for a Xi-Biden summit would depend on the United States show, enough sincerity. The security agency does not usually comment publicly, especially on foreign policy. Biden, for his part, has made comments, off the cuff at fundraisers or in brief exchanges with reporters, that have irked Beijing. In June, at a fundraiser, he called Xi a dictator who was unaware of the spy balloon and said that the Chinese president was very embarrassed when it got shot down. He also noted China was having real economic difficulties. Nonetheless, Biden has repeatedly indicated over the past several months that he was expecting to meet with Xi sometime in the future, in the near term, he said at a news conference in June. Last month, she skipped the G20 leadership summit in New Delhi, leading Biden to express disappointment. But, he added, I am going to get to see him. In remarks to the UN General Assembly in New York last month, he emphasized his desire to responsibly manage the competition between the two countries to avoid conflict. We are for de-risking, he said, not decoupling with China. China watchers have looked to the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in San Francisco as the setting for the meeting. For Xi to be a no-show, coming on the heels of his G20 absence and ducking out of a speech at a summit of developing nations in August, would be a poor look, said Danny Russell, a former White House Asia aide in the Obama administration. People will jump to the conclusion that the domestic economic and political problems are too great, he said. There's a cost to him not going. The Chinese embassy in Washington did not immediately respond to a request for comment. Biden administration officials are proceeding with plans for a meeting at APEC. The Chinese, said the U.S. official, want to do it. The White House, however, has decided it will bar Hong Kong's top government official, John Lee, from attending. Lee and 10 other Hong Kong and Chinese officials were sanctioned by Washington in 2020 after implementing a repressive national security law imposed by officials in Beijing. Russell, now Vice President for International Security and Diplomacy at the Asia Society Policy Institute, said the one thing both leaders have in common is a desire to stabilize ties and avoid some international crisis or brawl that could interfere with their domestic agendas. But neither one of them is open to making substantial concessions, he said. So whatever calming effect a meeting will have will be tactical and temporary. Still, he added, even that would be an improvement. Beijing has been pressing the United States to ease export controls on key technologies such as advanced semiconductors. Raimondo in August said she rebuffed an appeal by Chinese officials to rescind such controls, arguing that they were imposed for national security reasons. Instead, they agreed to set up a new commercial issues working group as a forum to engage on trade and investment matters. Other expected areas of discussion between the two leaders are China's crackdown on foreign companies following an expansion of a counter-espionage law and the release of detained Americans. Beyond differences over protectionist economic policies, America's opioid crisis is a likely subject of tension between the two leaders. Most fentanyl, a synthetic opioid that is the leading cause of death for Americans ages 18 to 45, is made in Mexico using precursor chemicals from China. After Representative Nancy Pelosi, Democrat, California, then serving as House Speaker, visited Taiwan in August 2022, Beijing announced it was freezing counter-narcotics and law enforcement cooperation with Washington. The United States has pressed China to resume cooperation, while also targeting some China-based traffickers and individuals with sanctions. Olivier Knox contributed to this report. How government neglect, misguided policies doomed Libya to deadly floods. The rain-flashing Derna gave residents a sense of comfort as night fell on September 10. Windows steamed up as dinners warmed on stovetops. Children curled up with their parents and watched cartoons long past their bedtimes. A 30-year-old store owner, Mohammed bin Kyle, texted his brother from a few blocks away to see whether he needed help. He said he didn't. He had obeyed government orders to shelter in place, like thousands of other families in the heart of the city. They thought they would be safe at home, away from the water's edge. It's just rain, Mustafa, a father of 5, texted back. But it wasn't. Authorities in both of Libya's rival governments had known for days that Storm Daniel was coming, and for years that the dams above the city were damaged and at risk of collapse. Yet officials loyal to military commander Khalifa Hifter, head of the eastern government based in Benghazi, appeared never to consider the threat, believing instead the worst of the flooding would come from the sea. Video evidence shows several evacuations being carried out among coastal communities in Derna, which prompted many people to move inland and into the path of the coming flood. A strict curfew, enforced by armed security personnel, required people to shelter in place. Multiple generations of families gathered together and were washed away. Warnings that the dams were filling up circulated among officials in the Ministry of Water Resources, which is responsible for water infrastructure and is part of the Western government in Tripoli. They were not shared publicly until water had engulfed the city, too late for Mustafa bin Khail and so many others. Coastal areas were evacuated because they expected those to flood, said Ahmad Shali, an official on Derna's Emergency Response Committee. People felt that the dam would protect them from flooding, so there was no urgency for them to flee. More than 12,500 people from the area are dead or missing, according to the World Health Organization. Residents and local activists believe the true number is far higher. Government restrictions have made it difficult for reporters to access the city in recent weeks. Protests calling for accountability ended in arrests. This account of the final days and hours leading up to the disaster is based on more than 24 interviews with residents, officials, and experts, as well as videos, social media posts and documents reviewed by the Washington Post. The former mayor of Derna, since relieved of his duties, as well as water management and other government officials in Tripoli did not respond to phone calls or text messages seeking comment. Efforts to reach Hifter through senior military officials were unsuccessful. A dangerous situation. Derna is built on the ruins of an ancient Greek colony, and its oldest families trace their lineage back to Andalusian times, when Muslims ruled modern-day Spain. It was home to Libya's first theater troupe and has a rich intellectual history. More recently, it has been caught up in the country's brutal civil conflict, occupied by Islamist groups and pummeled by government forces. After a months-long siege, Hifter took control of the city in 2018. In the years that followed, both the air force that Hifter commands and the militia led by his son Saddam have been accused by Amnesty International of routinely targeting, harassing and torturing their critics in Derna. Neither Hifter nor senior officials in Tripoli have responded to the allegations. In the mountains above the city, the Derna and Bu Mansour dams, built in the 1970s, had been damaged for decades. It was a dangerous situation, according to an unpublished 2006 study from the Ministry of Water Resources, later cited by Libyan academics who reviewed it. A report from the Tripoli-based Audit Bureau, submitted as part of an ongoing government investigation into the dam collapses, concluded that authorities in Tripoli failed to carry out even basic repairs. Instead, the report says, they overpaid a Turkish company by 4 million Libyan dinars for dam maintenance between 2007 and 2010, without encouraging them to finish the job or attempting to recover the funds when the project was left incomplete. The report was obtained, verified and shared with the Post by The Sentry, a Washington-based investigative group. While Libyan authorities have blamed the stalled maintenance on a popular uprising in 2011, the documents say that, after months of unexplained delays, work stopped completely at the end of December 2010. The Ministry of Water Resources had ample money to fix the dams in the years that followed, the report concludes, including 459 million dinars in development funds in 2021 alone. Last year, a study by hydrologist Abdelwaniz Ashur concluded that the situation in the Wadi Derna basin required immediate action. In the event of a huge flood, the result will be disastrous, he wrote. The dams were a preoccupation for Ashur, who had warned of their fragility as early as 2008 in his master's thesis. When he returned to Derna last year, he told the Post, he found the amount of surface runoff had increased and the probable maximum flood had increased because of conditions and soil runoff and the lack of vegetative cover. Trying to deliver those warnings to Libyan authorities felt like whistling in the ears of the dead, he said. Officials told the Post they did not consider that heavy rains could overwhelm the dams, or take steps to prepare for such a scenario. The situation in Derna looked very normal, there were no indicators that it would be a crisis, said Mohamed Doma, the water minister of the Benghazi-based government in eastern Libya. But he conceded, this is not an excuse for the amount of neglect that happened with the maintenance of the dams. All citizens must remain in their houses. As Storm Daniel approached, officials across eastern Libya held a flurry of crisis meetings, according to social media posts and accounts by officials. In Derna, a committee led by the head of the city's security directorate decided to evacuate several neighborhoods close to the waterfront, well outside the eventual flood zone. A September 9 order signed by eastern Libya's Prime Minister, Osama Hamad, declared a two-day holiday and told residents to limit their movements along roads. Workers from the local water and sanitation company started clearing drainage outlets with excavators along the coastline. Boy Scouts helped to evacuate a hospital and clean the streets. Red Crescent ambulances and police cars fanned out across waterfront neighborhoods, warning residents to leave. But in many instances, the authorities offered them no place to go. Families piled into cars, locals said, and headed inland to apartment blocks already filled with people waiting to ride out the storm. From his shoe store, Mohammed bin Khail watched the warnings loop across television screens and social media as he tried to focus on work. He locked up the store when he heard the police cars urging his district to shelter in place, slamming the blue shutters closed. It's probably best to be at home, he recalled thinking as he climbed in his car and headed out. The voluntary coastal evacuations continued on September 10. So did the curfew. Residents argued over whether to stay or go. Some didn't trust the weather reports, others didn't trust the authorities. Derna's municipal council announced on September 10 that the city would be shut down from 7 p.m. that night until 8 a.m. the next morning. On social media, government accounts simultaneously urged people to evacuate their neighborhoods and to obey the curfew. On the streets, a video shows armed security forces walking alongside emergency vehicles as loudspeakers blared, "All citizens must remain in their houses." A curfew would clear the roads for emergency vehicles and such, said Doma, the water minister, explaining the government's rationale. Abdul-Gader Faraj, a nurse in Derna, was starting to worry about his family. He was 700 miles to the west, in Misrata, where he had taken their eldest son for cancer treatment. His wife, Fatima, and their other 2 children had been told to evacuate their home on the coast in Derna. He was relieved when Fatima called her father to come pick them up, as the sun sank in the sky and the wind harried the trees on the seafront. Their neighbor, Ali, took his wife and children to his in-laws near the center of the city, Faraj said, then went to shelter with his parents further up in the valley. Videos from later that evening show emergency vehicles trying to make their way through the driving storm. Boy Scouts were still cleaning the valley in the dark, their yellow raincoats fluttering in the wind. In interviews after the storm, families described sheltering in place, steeling themselves for a long night. Children packed onto sofas and stretched out on living room floors, some excited to be with their cousins for a sleepover, others overtired and tearful. Parents stirred dinner pots and prepared school bags for the new term. On a street running down to the seashore, 43-year-old Abdulrazak Mustafa stepped outside briefly to check on the rains, then slipped back inside. His 2 youngest children had fallen asleep in front of the television. He picked them up gently and carried them to their beds. Abdulrazak Mustafa's phone barely stopped ringing through the swelling storm, as nervous relatives across the city checked in again and again. Shortly before midnight, Mohammed bin Khail texted his brother Mustafa to see if he needed help. Abdul-Gader Faraj called his wife. Everyone, it seemed, was safe. The incomprehensible part of this entire tragedy is the curfew imposed by the Derna Security Directorate from the start of the storm, said Hanan Sulla, Associate Director of the Middle East and North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch. This effectively trapped people in their homes, and from then on, they stood no chance. No one knew anything. Around midnight, the cell phone network crashed and the power failed. Derna was plunged into darkness. Every family's world shrank. Suddenly, no one knew anything about anyone else, Abdulrazak Mustafa said. At the Wadi Bou Mansour Dam, there was only one guard on duty that night, according to Claudia Gazzini, the International Crisis Group's senior analyst for Libya, who interviewed him and officials in Tripoli's Water Resources Ministry for a recent report. The rain had reached a frightening intensity by midnight. Water was rushing down the valley into the center of the city, spilling over into adjacent streets. The dam was filling up. The guard told Gazzini he called his immediate supervisor at the Water Resources Ministry in Derna, who relayed the warning to Benghazi. An official at the ministry in Benghazi told her that he notified Tripoli of the worsening situation. At 1:12 a.m. on September 11, a message was posted on Facebook, but the intended recipients were already cut off from the outside world. The Ministry of Water Resources in Tripoli assures citizens that the Derna Dam is safe and that rumors about it being broken are false, the message read. The dams are in good condition and things are still under control. By this point, they said they had already lost contact with the dam supervisors in Derna. Residents used different words to describe the sound they heard around 3 a.m. Some called it a boom, others a roar. One man said it sounded like the horizon had popped. Security camera footage shows a wave rushing so fast through the streets that it dragged cars along with it. Entire houses were carried into the sea and asphalt was ripped from the sidewalks. Abdulrazak Mustafa struggles even now to understand the strength he mustered in that moment, forcing their doors shut against the wave as he held his screaming children above him. Water had poured through the window and was rising past his chest. I couldn't think of myself, I knew I was going to die, he said. All I could do was pick them up and try to save them. Mohammed was trying his brother's cell phone again and again, but getting nothing. In neighborhoods with lower tides, people slipped in the streaming mud as they tried to flee, straining against wind gusts that knocked them backward. Some parents lost children underfoot or tripped over bodies in the scramble. Hospitals that still functioned were inundated. One medic saw 100 patients in the first hour. By daylight, it was closer to 1,000. Across Libya, rumors of a tragedy were spreading, but Derna was still in blackout. At 2:39 p.m. on September 11, Derna's municipal council confirmed on Facebook that the dams had burst. As the sun came up on the city, the scale of the damage was almost unimaginable. Mohammed finally found his brother, Mustafa bin Kyle, dead in the crush of his home. Across the road, another 20 of the brother's immediate relatives, all sheltering in place together, had drowned. Faraj's wife and children survived, but their neighbor, Ali, who had evacuated his family to stay with their relatives, learned that he had taken them right into the path of the flood. When Faraj called to offer his condolences, the man could barely speak through sobs. He brought his own kids and wife to death by his own hands, Faraj said. He was trying to keep them safe. An official in the Tripoli-based agricultural ministry, Ju.dy, agreed that people were not adequately warned of the dangers. But he said they were partly at fault for having built their homes along the river. They shouldn't just blame the government altogether, they should blame themselves too, he said. Among the dead were several police officers and Red Crescent workers involved in the curfew and evacuation efforts, according to witnesses and social media posts. More than 100 medical personnel were killed. So many lives were lost that day, and the people of Derna deserve in the very least to know why authorities who are meant to protect them failed them so miserably, said Sulla, of Human Rights Watch. 4,267 people have been buried. Another 8,500 people are missing and presumed dead. Some families are still asking for news on Facebook, clinging to hope. There were 2 people who saw him, but we haven't found him, wrote a woman looking for her husband. On his own page, Mohammed bin Kyle said the pain was now greatest for the living. It is the ones who survived in Derna who died, he wrote. Hiba Farouk Mahfouz contributed to this report.